Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us again. This is session 7 of the Three Spheres East, West, and Digital course being taught by the Center for the Study of Digital Life. We've teamed up with Shrikant's 52 Living Ideas, and we're in the final stretch here. Today and next Sunday, we'll be talking about the digital sphere. We have already covered 2 sessions on background context, 2 sessions on the East sphere, in which John Alton and Phil Midland, both involved with the center, gave us quite remarkable presentations. I have then done 2 sessions on the West sphere. So today and next Sunday will be the final sessions on the digital sphere. Shrikant, would you like to describe the format, please?
Absolutely. Folks, as I always say, you're going to be hit with a fire hose of ideas. And this is absolutely true when we get into the digital area, because that's what it feels like, the digital itself feels like, and it's going to be more so here. So you need your pen and paper in order to keep track of all your questions. We're going to try to deal with all the questions. So as soon as the presentation is over, presentation will be about 45 minutes. You will have an opportunity of asking all your questions. I will collect all the questions, figure out the map of the questions, and ask the questions to Mark one by one, more general questions first to more specific. Mark, back to you.
Thank you, Shrikant. I begin and end each of these sessions with the same recitation. We no longer live in the modern world. Digital technology has already compelled us to move to a new paradigm. More and more people are realizing that. As you look around you, it's quite amazing the range of people who have come to this view, but it's been going on now for 20 or more years. This course is designed to help you act responsibly in this new paradigm. This is an area that many have become confused about. We've covered an enormous amount of territory. Today is going to be a little bit different. Today, I'm going to suggest that what you think you're familiar with in terms of digital technology is actually a recovery, a retrieval of something that you may not know quite so much about or be so confident about. That is the topic of alchemy. So when we began this process of laying out the spheres, recognizing that globalism, after World War II, had attempted to unify everything, that clearly has failed. The East-West separation, particularly given how China has been behaving, has become clear enough that many people have suggested that there is a new Cold War, some sort of a contest for hegemony. That is the wrong way of thinking about what's happened here. Rather, what has happened is that digital technology has forced a fragmentation. When we began the process of identifying those spheres, we had more than 3. We were talking about 5 or 7. This occurred in 2015 when we began the Center for the Study of Digital Life. We decided to restrict it to 3, East, West, and digital, but that's really probably not adequate. There are a number of certainly in-between zones. If you think of Western Europe, United States as the West, there's a lot of things around the fringe of that. Where does Russia fit? If you think of China as the East, where does India fit? Where does Japan fit? So this is admittedly a simplification. If we had allowed 7 spheres or 5 spheres, we would be at this discussion probably far too long. The principle should be clear, though, that we no longer have a single unified world, but rather one that has been separated into very different sensibilities. Now, our description of East, West, and digital, as we have discussed before, is based upon the fundamental technologies used in these spheres for written communications. East, we have identified, as many of you know, with logographic writing. West has been identified with alphabetic writing, and digital is associated with code, programming. This is an unusual way to look at things, to be sure, but what is probably most unusual is that East and West can be thought of as civilizations that have been around for millennia. Many of people have identified, in particular, the axial age around 500 BC as a reasonable starting point. People would like to extend that further back in history, but in any event, East and West make a lot of sense over a long period of time. Digital, you might object, is something which is more recent. Computing, of course, was particularly aggressively pursued during World War II for code breaking and other purposes. And as we moved into the 50s, 60s, and beyond, the digital industry as we know it. Now, how could that possibly be a civilization? Our answer to that question is that digital retrieves alchemy. And so what you're going to see today will be discussion of the relationship between digital and alchemy. I'm going to convey this through a number of book covers. So this is a little bit different from the previous sessions, but let's see how it goes. Next slide, please. Alchemy is a topic that I've been studying for quite a long time. My guess is there are some people here who have also been studying it for a while. You may not, however, realize that alchemy has both an East and a West expression. In particular, in the East, there's a distinction between the esoteric or inner alchemy, known as nadon, and the external exoteric wedon. This is a parallel with the Western application of alchemy, which you probably associate with the transformation of base metals into golden metals. That, of course, was never really achieved. Atomically, it's not possible to transmute iron into gold. And so what was really going on? The answer is that Western alchemy, just like Eastern alchemy, from the beginning, was always an attempt to transmute souls, human beings, to change us from biological, mortal, flawed, to immortal, perfected, and even divine. So the immortality aspect of this, which was very prominent in the East, and there's a lot of literature, by the way, on this, if you're not familiar, and the singularity as an expression for the West, these are direct parallels, and this is at the root of what the digital sphere is trying to accomplish. So the literature on this is extensive. If you have a chance, the Taoist Internal Alchemy, as the author Prodadio has illustrated in many of his books, that's a reasonable place to start. But there's more. To be familiar with how, in particular, Chinese civilization has treated this, you might want to consider looking into Joseph Needham's Science and Civilization in China. This is a very extensive work now. A lot of it, however, is available online. And as it turns out, both Pragadio and Needham correctly understood that Eastern alchemy is deeply associated with Taoism. Anyone who has become attracted to Taoism, and there are quite a number in the West who've done this, might not be fully aware of how this has played out over the years. Most importantly, perhaps, in the Tang dynasty. So this is roughly 800 AD. Tang is spelled T-A-N-G, but as many of you know, is pronounced as if that A were O. So Tang dynasty was a dynasty in which Nidan, that's to say the internal alchemy, was deeply expressed all the way up to the top. Most of the work, however, that began this process started a few hundred years before that, particularly in the late Han dynasty. Moving over to the West, you might be familiar with the work of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, among many others. These characters, often referred to as Renaissance figures, were themselves building on a much longer history. And they then were taken up in the Renaissance. I think it's fair to say that a lot of this material was set aside after the printing press brought us into a much more linear approach. However, by the time we got into the 19th century and certainly in the 20th century, as you'll see, as I develop this, interest in these topics increased very substantially in the West. So we have here again, much as we have in the East and the West as civilizations or as spheres, we have thousands of years of attempts to transform humans from the ones that we see on the screen, from the ones that we live with, from the ones that we love and hate, into something that is no longer human. Next slide, please. This parallel between immortality and singularity is one that probably has not so much attracted your attention, but it should. As the book of Genesis indicates, of course, at the beginning of what became Judeo-Christian Western civilization, the sin of Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was then punished by making them mortal. So from the standpoint of Western tradition, mortality and dealing with death, which is a biological process, has been fundamental. So what we're dealing with here in alchemy, particularly the alchemy of the internal sort, the alchemy of the soul, has long been an effective attempt to defeat biology and even move into a self-deification. As Genesis again would instruct us, it was God who created this world, not humans. That attempt to become creators at that level, to control evolution, for instance, to define new species, is a self-deification maneuver. So I'll draw your attention to a couple of things that have happened recently. Perhaps you've seen these things and we can talk about them in the Q&A. A couple of weeks ago on Sunday night, Yuval Noah Harari did a very dramatic 60-minute section. In this section, he suggested that we had already crossed the threshold into creating new species. That is a follow-on comment to his most recently published book, Homo Deus. So here we're back to the theme of human beings considering themselves to be gods, and theologically, that activity is known as Gnosticism. Gnosticism is itself a topic, It fills massive libraries. We'll get into a couple of modern exponents of this later on in the presentation, but it is something that has been shared by both East and West civilizations. Very often, most typically, in fact, considered not to be orthodox. So if you want to think of what we're doing here, the digital sphere is retrieving the heterodox, the non-orthodox, the part that typically does not get academic attention, the part that typically does not get public expression, but it is there anyway. The elixir of immortality was a very serious pursuit at the pinnacle of the Nadon, internal alchemy, and this again probably had its most important high-level expression in the Tang Dynasty. Why is the Tang Dynasty important? Why do we care about something in Chinese history at that turning point? My answer is that Chinese leaders today often consider what they are doing as a retrieval of the Tang Dynasty. This was something that I learned 5-6 years ago when I was introduced to many of these figures. I've had a chance to talk with some of them at some great length about this. It might very well surprise you, but it is one of the cornerstones of the expression of self-confidence that China has now put forward to the world. That, as I have noted before, is very much parallel to what we've been hearing on the topic of singularity. So Ray Kurzweil is probably a figure familiar to many of you. I have had a chance to talk with him about this, but I will also direct you to the website 2045.com, which has been organized by a number of Russians who are looking at this topic. As it turns out, the Russians have a long history with this issue. If you're familiar with the cosmist movement, they very much, those associated with this website, very much think of themselves as a revival of the cosmist. So you could think of, under Soviet rule, the attempt to build a Soviet man, a new type of human being, as one of the many, many expressions of this. So I have just collected the titles of some books which you may or may not be familiar with. Authors you might know: Ray Kurzweil, Mikhail Kaku has talked about this at some great length. More recently, we have the Immortality Key, which is a discussion of how immortality was at the heart of the Eleusinian mysteries and other parallel activities going back deeply into antiquity in Athens, Greece. That's a fascinating recent book on this topic. As it turns out, the mystery of Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries, Eleusis being a town on the sea about 10 miles northwest of Athens. The result of that, if you're familiar with literature, was the conviction that the human soul was immortal, not the human body, but the human soul. So you will find all throughout Greek classical literature, including Plato, certainly Aristotle, they all had some relationship to this and built immortality of one kind or another into their philosophies. We are now retrieving that as an alchemical aspect of digital sphere. Next slide, please. Now, here I'm going to make a suggestion that may have never occurred to some on this call, but I'll tell you a little personal story. When I came to New York City in the early 1970s, one of the first things I did after I met some of the people that I was interested in working with is I formed a software company. So many here don't know me personally, which is fine, but you can go to, as everybody does nowadays, you can go to LinkedIn and find a bit about my professional history, and you'll see that I started a software company in 1972 called Computron. My later career on Wall Street as a technology analyst, as a technology strategist, and ultimately as a banker. I'm the investment banker who brought AOL public in 1992, 20 years later. But in the 70s, I was a coder, a programmer. My father, who had been a historian of ancient mathematics, I had heard the story that he had learned 17 extinct languages. So I set about to learn 17 coding languages. So for a while there, I was juggling all of these. I've forgotten, of course, all of this, and many of these languages have in fact become extinct. But as it turns out, there is today a programming language called Alchemy. The symbol, A with an underscore to it, if you enter into Google, Alchemy programming, you'll come up with a long list of references to the Alchemy Code Institute. There is, in fact, a fair amount of literature about the relationship between alchemy and coding, because, in fact, both of them used ritualized manipulations of symbolic languages. For those here who may have had a chance to study Western or Eastern alchemy, you'll know that what's involved here tends to be very involved, cryptic languages, a lot of it quite secret, a lot of it having to do with symbols that are not even linguistic. And so the manipulation of matter and form, psyche, has been at the heart of both coding and the ritualized aspects of alchemy. In other words, if you went through the process of attempting to generate the philosopher's stone, which was the substance that was supposed to be the transformative substance, you had to follow a set of procedures very carefully. This is quite the same psychological process as writing program code. So when Doug Rushkoff wrote a book, Program or Be Programmed, he was noting that, in fact, this process is a psychological one, and it is one that is intentionally a manipulation of both matter and psyche. This correspondence between code and alchemy as rituals is perhaps one that has not been fully elaborated yet and deserves to be much more carefully described. Next slide, please. As some of you might well know, it turns out that there is an extensive academic study today of these topics. This began, I would say, probably in earnest in the 60s and 70s. A few relatively wealthy individuals, particularly some located in Amsterdam, have been funding academic centers, but it has gotten to the point now that we're into the second and third generation of academics studying these topics. University of Amsterdam is arguably the primary center for this. Academics have gone through, initially, I would say France was probably the center. That's moved now to Amsterdam, from Paris to Amsterdam. But along the way, there's a British location at Exeter. There's also a fairly serious effort that went underway at the University of Indiana in the US. And for those of you who find yourself with some time on your hands in Amsterdam, what used to be called the Hermetic Library or the Rittman Library, after the name of one of these wealthy individuals who's been funding this research, it is now called the Embassy of the Free Mind. It's moved to a new location. It's a museum. They have a massive collection of literature, And so this is no longer, as we've moved into digital conditions, this is no longer in the shadows. This is no longer heterodox. Esoteric study, Western esotericism, has become a well-respected academic field. I am fortunate, and perhaps some of you are also on these sorts of lists. Academia, as a publisher, has been sending me almost daily in their effort to get me to subscribe various monographs and articles from journals. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands of these now circulating. So we have shifted from a situation in which alchemy was pushed aside, operated only in the shadows, to one in which it's very much out in the open, as is fitting for the digital paradigm which we now live, and as is fitting as an underpinning for the digital sphere, which we're talking about here today. Next slide, please. Okay. Maybe one of the most familiar areas, so I'll spend a little bit of time here on this, would be Carl Jung and his protege, Jordan Peterson. Now, I don't know how much, we'll find out, hopefully, in the Q&A, how much you have had a chance to dig into Jung. Jung, of course, famously, split with Sigmund Freud on exactly these issues. Recently, the Bollingen Foundation, which is the publishing arm of the Jung world, published a remarkable book. For a while, this was the subject of a museum exhibition in New York. So there is a museum devoted to these topics. This has now become so widely public. And the Red Book is meant to be the notebook that Jung in his lifetime did not publish. The reason why it eventually became published probably as a result of a whole series, actually, of efforts to identify Jung with both Gnosticism and alchemy. It turns out that Jung's arguably closest collaborator, Marie-Louise von Franz, and yes, Marie-Louise is a male name, wrote extensively about the topic. Here I've included the cover for Alchemical Active Imagination as one of the more interesting extensions of Jung's work. But there's a great body of literature about this. So I've described Carl Jung as perhaps the most important religious figure of the 20th century. That, of course, is a fairly bold statement. There have been many other very interesting figures, popes and others, but Jung's ability to set alchemy and its related Gnosticism at this level has captured the imagination of virtually everybody has had to look at this at one point or another. A book appeared a few years ago, cover is not here on the screen in front of you, entitled The Aryan Christ. For those who are interested in Carl Jung and his background, that would be a good place to take a journey, because it got the author, Richard Knoll, in deep, deep trouble. It is my best guess that the Red Book was the result of the Bollingen Foundation trying to somehow get back on track. But there's a lot of literature on this topic. More recently, of course, Jordan Peterson has come to be quite prominent. So my guess is that you have, many here on this call have had a chance to listen to one or more of Peterson's extensive YouTubes. For quite a while, he was remarkably successful in attracting large audiences, particularly of young men who would pay him a good deal, audiences of thousands, maybe 5,000, 10,000 at one point, were paying him for extensive presentations. And for those of you who followed his personal history, you might have noticed that this caused great anxiety for Jordan Peterson. He wound up with a serious anti-anxiety drug, benzodiazepine addiction. He found that he could not clear himself of that with typical Western medicine. He wound up in Russia. He wound up in a bunch of places. He wound up going through some very extreme treatments. And this was all after he had already begun to describe to people how he couldn't take it anymore. But Jordan Peterson is somebody who will be with us, I hope, for a while. He seemed to have straightened things out. They may even be at Jordan Peterson University in the offing. Peterson is an explicit Jungian. When you get past the superficial levels of what he is saying, you will find Carl Jung deeply embedded, particularly in his original extensive discussion of mapping of meaning. He has progressed to 12 rules for life and beyond order. But what lies underneath all of this, what lies underneath his clinical practice, University of Toronto, what lies underneath his popularity is, again, an expression of this Jungian alchemical. In this case, Jung, of course, had described an anima and an animus as the light and dark sides. And so individuation is the language of the Jungians. So you will find Jordan Peterson in his psychological clinical advice returning to the question of individuation, and in particular, the ability to balance between the light and dark. This is all just to indicate to you how widespread all of this has become. Now, where is this taking us? Next slide, please. So what I'm doing here, I'll spend a few minutes. I'm trying to preview the next session next week. And what we're dealing with is a sensibility that has taken the millennia-old notion of transmuting base to golden souls and a century plus of attempts to manipulate human behavior through social sciences, and this break that has occurred in all of this as a result of digital technology. I will talk more about the relationship between digital and post-humanity next week, but I wanted to throw this slide in to give you an opportunity to begin thinking about this. Post-humanism has, in many respects, become the replacement in academia for postmodernism. Post-human philosophy has become a hot topic in academic fields. Older than that, going back to the 90s, originally under a name or various names, but the one I know is extropian. When I first met Max Moore, that was what he was doing, has now morphed into a larger organization called Humanity Plus. And as you probably know, they're even now running political candidates, at least level of president, in order to attract a great deal of attention. So this development, the development of attempting to overcome biology, the development to seriously try to develop immortality, is deeply linked to digital technologies and its promises, which we'll examine in some detail next week, for artificial general intelligence, the whole notion that human beings as information processors, which we are not, as it turns out, but that's a very popular theme, are in the process now, if they haven't already, been superseded by the machines that we have been modeled against. The question, what is our future, has been opened up for a very wide range of speculation. The book covers that I have shown you today in this presentation. Next week, we'll get back more to the, so what do we think about all of this? But what I wanted to expose you to this week was the fact that this is everywhere. It's extremely difficult to miss all of this. I want to note for you, a week and change ago, Henry Kissinger got up on stage at the Stryker Center at Temple Emmanuel in New York, along with his co-authors, Eric Schmidt and another artificial intelligence researcher. This was, for me, as somebody who has followed Kissinger's career closely, who's been involved with geopolitical discussions for many years, who has always thought of Kissinger's relationship to this, including his relationship to the formation of the Center for the Study of Digital Life through a alternative to Kissinger, Andrew Marshall. I was totally blown away. Kissinger is 98 years old. That presentation may be the last we will ever see him in public. And yet he has now co-authored a book called The Age of AI. And he said that his studying of this topic, which has only been the last couple of years, primarily driven by Eric Schmidt, the book he published before this said that he thought that the world that he had lived in had already been replaced by something else, but he didn't know what that something else was. What he is now telling us is he has figured out what it is, and it is post-human. He said it is now impossible to do geopolitical strategy as he has done through his entire career. He raised the question of what do you do when you rely upon what you think are precision-guided smart munitions, when in fact, the bomb, which you believe you have targeted for a particular street corner in Afghanistan, decides on its own to turn around and come back and land on you. How do you do geopolitical strategy under those circumstances? What Kissinger said is his entire career was based around the notion of, or twin notions rather, of capabilities and purposes. So what he told us was that it is no longer possible for us to judge the capabilities of the weapons that we're designing. But more importantly, he said, it's no longer possible for us to judge their purposes. If the capabilities and the purposes cannot be known, then how do you proceed? This juncture is the territory of the digital sphere. This is a territory of trying to replace humans with a better, more perfect, and in their view, potentially even immortal, post-human world. New species controlling evolution. This is literally every place, from 60 Minutes to Henry Kissinger speeches to best-selling books. I hope I've done a reasonable job here today to convince you of how widespread this is and what we're now in the midst of, and why this deserves, because it is linked back to this millennia-old notion of alchemical transformation of humans. Why this deserves to be considered as a third sphere. I very much look forward to the Q&A that will follow here. Next slide will just, again, tell us Well, not that one, but the next one. So here we are. We're 7 weeks into a course that has laid out what has replaced globalism as East, West, and digital. I'll wait until the very end to repeat the description that I have for this entire course, but I very much look forward to your Q&A. It's often the best part. No, not often. It's always the best part. I hope that I've stimulated some thoughts from you. Shrikant, please take over.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. All right. So folks, it's time for questions. The way we're going to do questions is please go ahead and line up for the questions by typing an exclamation mark in chat or raising your hand in Zoom. All right. I'll give a couple of minutes, about 30 seconds for people to line up. You can just type an exclamation mark. You don't need to type the whole question in. You can speak out your question. At this point, only questions. Let's collect as many questions as possible. Then we're going to see the shape of the questions, and we will go from there. So folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark if you have any questions. Going to give it a couple of minutes here. All right, so we're going to start with Daljit. Daljit, go ahead. What's your question?
Thanks, Mark. Been tracking this for a few weeks, and a lot of these things some of these probes in the McLuhan tradition that you've been leading us down my journaling has been rich. So just a couple of things maybe you can connect for me. I think it's interesting that cryptography had its birth during the medieval ages, and the alchemists were the first cryptographers.
Correct.
I wonder if you can draw a line to that and cryptocurrency, a new digital asset. The second thing, when you mentioned the immortality key, and knowing your background somewhat in psychedelics, and me as a son of the electric ghost, I've been thinking about the resacralizing of the sacrament, because you talked about the church and virtue in the previous sessions. Right. Will psychedelics be part of the virtue revival via the illusion mysteries? And maybe those two are connected, because there's a recent article on Medium that people are getting the download in ayahuasca visions to embrace cryptocurrency. So, and then just you also mentioned once in a lecture that you said Jung was now irrelevant because he was an electric guy. And so now you've mentioned Jung and referenced him, and skipped Hillman, who is all about the imagination, right? Yeah. And so I just pick maybe one of those three or alchemically blend them together in your answer. That would be great.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Daljit. Great questions. Next up is going to be John Alton, Simone, Bill, and John Davis. John Alton, go ahead. Okay. I think there may be an issue with his mic. So he asks, explain how East Digital is different from the West Digital. So East versus West Digital. From Daljit, we have got, what does virtue revival look like in the digital age, and role of cryptography and cryptocurrency and its connection to the digital. Next up is going to be Simone. Simone, go ahead. Oh, wait a minute, John, go ahead. Do you want to elaborate on your question?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, I just wanted him to comment on the difference between the East's approach to digital and the West, which I think digital seems to be kind of breaking off from the West, but it's, what started here, the Silicon Valley part, and also the different trajectories that possible trajectories that crypto can take, given the three spheres and the way that they're behaving, if you could kind of frame those things.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, John. Next up is Simone. Simone, go ahead. Simone, you need to unmute.
Hi, I can't speak much. I've lost my
Oh,
voice.
that's fine. Simone, I will read out the question for you. Okay. Thank you. To what end is the AGI seeking to replace humans? Do they have a telos? What is the purpose of AGI? What is driving AGI? Okay. Next up is Bill. Bill, go ahead.
I want me to do this live. So this is a question I've asked Mark many times. I'll do it again, and he can float it in. So what does the trajectory of the digital sphere look like if you adopt the premise that creating functional transhumans is just impossible, can't be done?
Okay, excellent. What does digital look like? Not possible for humans. Okay, excellent. Next up is going to be John Davis. John.
Thank you. There's memories that I can retrieve with my nervous system. I can remember a conversation I had with Shrikant yesterday in his presentation. This morning, I can look at the video that was posted and look at that conversation. So there's the retrieval of a memory by a nervous system. There is a retrieval of a memory by a computer, but it seems like both the computer generated and the nervous system generated requires a nervous system. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned previously, I missed some of today's talk, but previously you mentioned perfect memory and the conflict that we have around perfect memory, something new, perhaps it's occurring because of our technology. So my question is, and when a perfect memory, what is memory before perfect memory?
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, John. So the difference between memory in the brain and digital, and what's the difference between memory and perfect memory? Excellent. Next up is going to be Barbara. Barbara, go ahead. Okay, I'm going to read it out. Will retrieval be limited to the elites in the digital sphere, thus creating a more embodied majority who fight not to have their psyches manipulated? So what is digital going to create an elite group that we're going to have to fight with? Next up is Doc. Doc, go ahead.
I turned off the mic. Sorry. It's all in the question I put in the chat. By coincidence, I was asked today if something I wrote called "What Does the Internet Make of Us" into a book, and I'd rather not, because I drew it largely on the kind of stuff you've been talking about here for a long time, Mark, and schooled me on, along with Eric McLuhan, who schooled me later, and I'm busy doing other stuff. So I'd like to see this be a book. I mean, you probably plan that anyway, but I don't know. So what's the deal?
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Laura, followed by John. Laura.
Okay, like what's going to happen with our society, where we have so many people who haven't even begun to understand a computer or used a computer, and we have, such a diversity in our population of the haves and the have-nots, even in terms of ownership of computer, blah blah blah. And now you're bringing in this whole other realm of things, which, by the way, I hope you have a section in this where you help take the fear out of, how to remove fear of all of this in the everyday person, because you've left me absolutely terrified of what's going to happen. But anyway, so that's my question. I mean, we're just going to build more divisiveness as the world changes. I mean, how are we as a society going to be able to cope with this change, which is very revolutionary?
Thank you. How does digital technology transform the difference between the gulf between haves and have-nots, and what will happen to people who are not computer literate? Next up is going to be John, followed by Mike. John.
Yes, I'm just curious if they're ever going to be able to digitize subjective consciousness.
Sorry, you broke up in the middle. Could you repeat your question?
Sure, I'm wondering if they're going to be able to digitize subjective consciousness.
Beautiful, beautiful question. Can you digitize subjective consciousness? Excellent. Next up is going to be Mike. Mike, just a question, please.
You've defined a new renaissance beyond anything we could have ever imagined, and maybe still can imagine. What can you do about politics, economics, guns, germs, and steel propelling us to into the Stone Age on the new wings of science?
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up, so what are the implications of this for politics and economics? Next up is, let me see, the Mike A. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, Mark, if somebody like Maslow was to produce a hierarchy of needs today in 2021, where would you put our ability to interact digitally? Closer to the self-actualization side or down to the physiological base?
Mm-hmm. Right. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Where does the digital fit in the hierarchy of human needs? All right. What a group of questions, Mark. So let's see, where shall we start? So first question is about the consciousness. A couple of people raised it. Can you digitize subjective consciousness? Can you digitize the human soul?
So this is Bill's question. Bill is correct. We have talked about this for a long time. We've come at the topic from many different directions. Let me see if I can summarize all of that in the following way. I do not believe it is possible to recreate human beings in silicon. Bill's premise that it cannot be done, I believe, is one that we should embrace. There are many twists and turns down this road. A lot of them have to do with the simple fact that the models being used to apply to humans are simply incorrect. We are not information processors. We cannot be modeled as computers. So therefore, the comparison that is driving so much of this work is fundamentally flawed. But that said, it has never, for the Center for the Study of Digital Life, for my own work, all my conversations with Bill, who's a part of that whole process, it has never been the actual capability to generate AGI that has been our concern. Rather, it has been the number of people and the resources devoted to trying to accomplish this. So if you were to take a look at everything that's in motion in the world today, there's a whole lot of people spinning around, chasing their tails. There's a whole lot of, as always, there's a whole lot of effort to hold on to the past. There's a whole lot of attempting to game the system. And the net of this is that it is those activities that have the most dynamic. It's those activities that have the highest velocity, those activities that have the most money behind them that tend to shift the overall balance. So if we were to consider everyone who is excited about space travel, for instance, and all the resources associated with that, if we were to take all of the government money that's being invested in artificial intelligence, if you take a look at budgets that are being drawn up over the next 5 to 10 years, it is overwhelmingly in the direction of attempting to accomplish these goals. That must distort everything else that goes on. The United States government, French government, Russian government, Chinese government, Japanese government, all of these governments, and the billionaires who were devoted to these sorts of things, they wind up being, if you will, the motive force in our lives at this point. That will need to be counterbalanced. And so the process of shifting resources, shifting decision-making is only now just beginning. So we're decades into this process. So the direct answer to the various questions here about whether subjective consciousness can be duplicated in machines, I believe is no. The reason for that is that human beings are inherently a embodied, organic characterization. Our substance, if you will, is different from what all of those attempts are going to be. Furthermore, what makes us operate as humans, the form, the soul that drives this, is simply not understood by those who are attempting to do this. Now, I suspect what's going to happen here is that we will be drawn into some of these design processes. I've gone out of my way to try to find out if it's underway. At this point, I think it is not underway in the West. That's to say, people who truly, deeply understand the form of the soul. I don't think that's well known at all. But I believe that the efforts in the East are probably ahead of those in the West. I think that these efforts are probably going to only ramp up. And so we're heading into a very difficult time in terms of potential conflicts. Not only have East and West separated from each other, and that inherently raises the risk of conflict, but the introduction of a third component in here dramatically increases the potentials for conflict. So I'll just refer here in that regard as one of the ongoing themes of what we've been discussing here in three spheres. The astrophysics problem of a three-body situation. So those of you familiar with the Chinese science fiction of Cixin Liu, there's a trilogy entitled Remembrance of Earth Past. The first volume is a three-body problem. Three-body problems in astrophysics and potentially in geopolitics have no straightforward solution. So we've gone from a situation in which conflicts of the sort that Henry Kissinger spent his entire life trying to resolve. Henry is correct. We have moved into a totally new paradigm for which we do not have solutions. Maybe the next question would be good.
Thank you. Next question, I want to take another question that talks about the similarities and differences between human and computers, and that is on memory. You talked about, Marshall McLuhan talked about saying that perfect memory is being recovered, perfect memory,
right.
Total and exact. What is the similarity and difference between human memory with our brains, neuroscience, with our neurology, and the digital memory?
Human beings are organisms with nervous systems that are very poorly understood as information processors. I recently read an essay, the title of which is The Empty Brain. The notion that we have memories in specific places is fundamentally wrong. Whereas computers are all constructed around very specific, local places where the memory is stored, and it must be there, and it must be perfect, and it must be exact, as McLuhan had indicated in the retrieval for computers in his tetrad work. So the difference is enormous. That difference, being very poorly understood, is one of the primary reasons why AGI is unlikely to happen. But that said, human memory, which up until now has been largely unmolested, that's no longer the case. So the questioner was correct that we're now in the process of reorganizing human organic memories to live in a world in which, in many senses, nothing is forgotten. That's never been the case before. We do not know how to live that way. So the op-ed in today's New York Times by Shoshana Zuboff, the person who coined the term surveillance capitalism, only begins to scratch the surface. What Facebook or Google know about me is in the process necessarily of becoming many orders of magnitude far more complete. Now this, because I have had some association with what I guess you would call the intelligence community, wraps back around through the humans who are using these capabilities. Surveillance capitalism, Shoshana's concerns about having ads served up to her or her children, which are intrusive, it is really not the problem that we're all facing today. We're in a situation where, let us say, for instance, something I don't think that's going to happen, but there may be some folks here who do. Let's say that the metaverse, or Meta, as Facebook now calls itself, let's say that does actually succeed, at least in some sense. So you may have seen that Microsoft did a deal with Meta to link their Teams software with what's being done with virtual spaces in Meta. You might also know that the last attempt at this, which got some traction, got a couple of corporations, IBM and Cisco in particular, to sign up for Second Life and conduct an enormous number of internal meetings. So, needless to say, everything that you do in a virtual space, as Sting might put it, every breath you take, I'll be watching you. So the degree to which information about us, which today is relatively benign, I always wish people happy birthday on Facebook. And in particular, I wish them digital life on their birthday. Now, if you go into Facebook, you can find out what they know about you. I don't click on ads. I don't buy things through Facebook. They know very little about my tastes, but they do know that I'm big on birthdays. So I'm sure that feeds the ad algorithm, but it is relatively painless. That will no longer be the case. So perfect memory, total and exact, in the hands of other human beings, attempting to manipulate us, can only be responded to by effectively reorienting our lives and turning it off. So we are heading into a maelstrom of surveillance, way beyond anything that Shoshana has talked about. And this is using memories, digital memories, against us as humans. Our ability to adapt to that situation is going to be crucial. And we have only just begun to think this through.
Wonderful. Now, a really tough question from Daljit. What does virtual revival look like in the digital age?
Mm-hmm. The retrieval process, which McLuhan described by far the best, was the process of bringing the archaic, including psychedelic drugs, into the electric era. So that sensibility of retrieval is something that is now going to be challenged. Instead, what we are going to retrieve is a very different kind of scribal sensibility that was not involved in that archaic activities. So what is that going to look like? Debbie Newman, who's on the screen here, and I went to a remarkable exhibit yesterday at the Morgan Library. And I would highly recommend to anybody who is in New York and otherwise inclined. Morgan Library is one of my favorite museums in New York. And as it turns out, medieval manuscripts, when they became available in the 19th century, particularly in the United States, and of course, the medieval manuscripts were largely in Europe, not in the United States, but now they're here. So what happened is that Pierpont Morgan and another fellow in Baltimore by the name of Waters, they were the ones at that moment who went out and bought basically everything that came on the market. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff in libraries, a lot of stuff in museums in Europe, but a substantial amount of that transited over here. So this is an exhibit called Imperial Splendor, talking about the Holy Roman Empire, with a combination of Pierpont Morgan and Mr. Waters, there's a Waters Museum in Baltimore I wasn't aware of before that. So you will get to see what was involved. And this is a partial answer to the question. If we are truly retrieving the medieval, then we're going to have to investigate how they operated. So these illuminated manuscripts, hand done, remarkably beautiful, but meaningful in ways that we do not now comprehend, will be a part of that process. But I also want to emphasize another aspect of this, which Shrikant and I are going to delve into in the follow-on course next year. And answering Doc's question, yes, this course will become a book. So all of this material is going to wind up on, I don't know if it'll wind up on paper, but it'll certainly wind up as an electronic book. And we'll do the same for next year. And what I want to bring in here now is the fundamental principle of medieval society, which I believe, will be retrieving. And that name is probably one not familiar to people here much. We'll have to deal with it in some great detail in the next course. It's called subsidiarity. So the tendency to concentrate everything in a smaller and smaller number of people's hands, which is this surveillance process, is going to be counterbalanced by an effort to bring decisions, responsibilities down to the smallest possible level. So we're now caught in a winds are blowing us in both directions. And here answering another question that was asked, does this mean we're heading into an elite situation in which only a few people have access to that? That has been a common conclusion when people take a look at the effects of digital technology. I do not think that is the outcome. It is certainly going to be the case that some will try to do that. I do not think they're going to succeed. This fragmentation, which has already occurred in geopolitical terms, which is why we're able to do a course on 3 spheres and get away with it, continues all throughout our lives. the notion that we all now have to orient ourselves towards increasing responsibility in our own lives has been enormously accelerated by COVID. I believe that the vast number of people who are quitting their jobs, while it could be described in economic terms, it could be described in all sorts of ways, I think it is an indication that people are literally taking responsibility for their lives in a way they never did before. That transference of responsibility to depending on somebody likely unknown, likely hiding behind the curtain, the Wizard of Oz, taking care of us, that will not be sustained. We're moving rather into a situation driven by digital technology. So here I'm trying to answer Laura's question and other questions about how scary this is. I do not think they will succeed. I think we're in a situation here now where the human beings will be compelled to understand much better what it means to be human. The more we try to build machines that pretend to be human, the more the humans have to understand what it actually means to be human. In the process of doing that, people who've lived their lives in a relatively mechanical, one foot in front of the other fashion, are already deeply questioning whether they want to continue doing that. The economic implications of this are enormous, as are the political implications. So subsidiarity is a topic you can look up, you can begin to study. That will help you as we move towards this new paradigm in a much more explicit fashion. But we are devolving those or decentralizing, as was always, remember, we were told from the very beginning that digital technology was going to decentralize everything. Well, in fact, that is exactly what's happening on a very, very broad scale. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Mark. And for those people, those of you in New York, Morgan Library is fantastic. And on Fridays from 2 to 5 p.m., it's free. You need to make a reservation if you want to see this exhibit. On Fridays, it is free from 2 to 5 p.m. Next question, I want to take the question from Rupali about education, but I want to broaden it slightly. In order to prepare ourselves, how do we educate ourselves and our children?
Right. Education is essential. And in particular, it is essential in the ages that we would have previously called grammar school. So in the years between our ability to accomplish reading, writing, and arithmetic, Debbie and I were talking about this the other day, those three, the three R's, so to speak, those are a reduced version of what was previously known as the liberal arts. There's 7 liberal arts. Those 7 consist of the trivium. We are actually now in the process of starting a graduate school to try to train much older people in the trivium. Trivium being grammar, dialectics, and rhetoric, combined with the 4 components of the quadrivium. This was the medieval curriculum. Many people have already begun training their children in a version of this. It's happening in homeschooling, obviously not happening in public schools. So my somewhat abstract answer to the question here is that we need to begin to train at a much earlier age in the way that, to be fair, only aristocrats in the Middle Ages could be trained. But it is now possible for us all to be, in a certain sense, aristocrats. Shifting our education from an education for a job that no longer exists, shifting our education from obedience to a set of means which no longer are effective. That whole collection of educational processes, allowing our children to be raised by television, all of that will need to be reexamined. So as we take more responsibility for our lives, the most significant component of that, where subsidiarity begins, of course, is in the family. So in those years, between a initial recognition and an initial set of capabilities, before that's get cut off by puberty, as we biologically prepare for reproduction, there's a critical period there of 4 or 5 years. And that period, we used to call it grammar school, is the essential period where sensibilities, biases, ultimately premises for arguments are formed. We are going to have to return to a deep concentration of the implications of what happens in our lives in that time period. The important fact to remember here is that we have a lot of knowledge about this already. We do not have to start from scratch. There's an enormous amount of developmental knowledge about this. There's an enormous amount of material that can be drawn, in particular from the original liberal arts, which have largely been evacuated, and so we'll have the field to ourselves. And so a revision of education for responsibility in a world that has been decentralized now becomes our task. And I'm actually quite confident that we can do it.
Mike asked, where does digital fit in the hierarchy of needs? What kind of a need is it?
Right. It so happens, I'm sorry if I'm going to disappoint anybody here, that Abe Maslow rejected his hierarchy of needs at the end of his life. In fact, he spent the last decade of his life trying to somehow get out of all that. So just to start with, since I never met Maslow, but I happened to meet the guy who popularized Maslow. And this was actually happened through the magazine Psychology Today. I know some of the details involved here. So I guess my answer to Mike's question is, we now need to pick up Maslow's own efforts to re-sculpt the hierarchy of needs. And so I think the reason why Maslow, and Mike's nodding his head, so he knows probably more than I do about this, Maslow was concerned, as he should have been, that self-actualization at the top of the pyramid would turn into what McLuhan called the inner trip. We would lose track of the rest of the world. We would wind up becoming also self-centered. That never worked out quite that way, but the upper levels of that pyramid are going to be redrawn, and digital will be responsible for allowing us to accomplish that. I don't know that anybody might very well, but anybody has really taken up this task. But I think the documentation on what Maslow was trying to accomplish is clear enough that we can do that. So my answer is, the pyramid of the hierarchy of needs needs to be redrawn, and digital will compel us to do that.
Wonderful. Next question was from the other Mike. He says, what are the political, economic, social implications, both in the West, in America, across the world? What are the implications of digital on all the systems that are out there?
I think, first of all, we're probably going to begin recognizing that these are not systems. Rather, they are the products of societies, which are not systems, cultures, which are not systems, organisms, which are not systems, And so my first answer to the question, as it's posed, is we're going to get out of this compelling feeling that we have to treat these things as systems. So what has developed over the course of the past 50 plus years as systems thinking will be challenged. But to answer the broader component of Mike's question is that new sensibilities necessarily imply new solutions. So effectively, everything which we now have, as it was built up assiduously on top of a print paradigm, giving us the US Constitution, an electric paradigm, which gave us the crazy world which we now live, all of that is up for grabs. How we come out of all of this on the other side is certainly unknown. What is known, though, is that everything must go. as another colleague of ours at the center, James Poulos, in his recently published book, Human Forever, which I would recommend that you take a look for. It will not be available at Amazon. It's being published on blockchain, and copies are not being sold yet, but Poulos is Poulos, Human Forever. If you Google that, you will be driven to his webpage to sign up and get updates. As he says, in quoting me at the end of the book, I'm the one who said, and of course, there's all kinds of ways this could be taken, but everything must go is, among other things, what happens when a store pretends they're going out of business and wants to get in the door. So it's a standard meme that gets thrown up on shop windows in New York City and probably other places. It's also the first words uttered in one of my favorite miniseries on television called Wild Palms, which was produced by Oliver Stone. The lead character is Jim Belushi. I'm not going to ruin anything for anybody here. If you want to take a look at it, he wakes up in the middle of the night. He doesn't know what's going on. He goes to his backyard. There's a swimming pool there. As is common in Los Angeles, it's drained, and there's a white rhinoceros in the swimming pool. And Jim Belushi says, so this is how it begins. The title of that first episode is Everything Must Go. So the basic answer to these questions is we are now responsible for constructing something that is radically different. I'm sure across the sweep of people here, there will be a wide range of opinions about whether we're up to the task or not. I happen to think that when push comes to shove, humans have the capacity to do this. But Mike, it's all become quite dangerous in this interim time period. I'm 73. My kids are 39 and 35. My kids will see how this turns out. I will not. I don't know how many people on the screen here will be around long enough to see how this turns out. But what I do know is that the dangers in the situation are at least matched by the opportunities in the situation. So it is that confrontation that we're now all devoting ourselves to, so we can try to act responsibly under these conditions.
Mark, throughout we've been talking more about dangers than opportunities. So could you talk a little bit more about opportunities, the upside that is possible with the digital?
I think, Srikant, that will probably be the focus of our next class.
Oh, wonderful. So then in that case, can you tell us?
All right. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have the answer to the question on opportunities is we are humans forever. We will simply not put up with being reduced to something other than that. And so in the West, we will actually recover virtue. That means both the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues, because we are, as the West, we are Judeo-Christian. And so religion will play a bigger and bigger role. Families will play a bigger and bigger role. Leisure will play a bigger and bigger role. And that is the basis of culture. So all of the positive aspects of our lives can be and will be reinforced. I really have no doubt about that. And if it wasn't for the human soul, which is a form of the organism, if it wasn't for that and the restoration of an understanding of that, I wouldn't be sitting in front of you here today with any opportunities. It is the opportunities that flow from the human soul. And as I noted, Shrikant and I are going to do another 8-week course early next year. I hope many of you come back, and I promise you we will emphasize far more the opportunities than the risks.
Wonderful. So, Mark, what are you doing for the last session?
I'm going to get into some detail about what the digital sphere is attempting to do to us and how we're going to respond to it. So the reason why I ended with a post-humanity question mark slide is because my answer is no. So I'm going to actually take up this question of opportunities and risks, pointing us to the next course. So in all of these cases, what we have been doing is taking a step, maybe 2 or 3 steps down the road, but we know this is a very long journey. We're not going to be able to finish that with this course or the next one, but we have made enormous progress as best I can tell. I want to thank Shrikant for his incredible skill in guiding people through this process, teaming up with the Center for the Study of Digital Life. And let me just finish with the comment that I've been making at each of these sessions. We no longer live in the modern world. All the institutions, all the prejudices, all of the premises associated with modern life are now in the process of being discarded. Digital technology has forced this transformation on us. As a result, for us to act responsibly, which is going to be enormously important, more and more important, more and more being shown all around us, to act responsibly, we're going to have to understand both the causes and the effects associated with digital technology. This course and the next course have been designed to help us navigate that. I thank you all very much for your participation in this. This has been a great experience for me, and we have a long ways to go. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everybody, for your great questions. Have a nice afternoon. Bye.